Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today, and everything that I've heard so far has been extremely interesting, so thank you all. I want to start by talking about the fact that when I was writing this thesis and doing this research, I was largely thinking about it from an audience engagement perspective, or how do we engage audiences, and how is audience engagement changing in a time when news business models and revenue models are also changing. And I came to it from that perspective, but a lot of what I've been thinking about since starting at the Shorenstein Center has been this idea of, in a world where information disorder is such a pervasive problem, as Cam just showed us, what does that mean for the organizations that are trying to make sure that accurate information stands out? If you're a news organization or if you're a public health organization and you are trying to communicate to audiences in situations of disease outbreaks or any other public health situation, you want to make sure that information is as accurate and as communicable as possible, because there is so much out there that is otherwise. So when I started thinking about this, I was framing my research around three ideas: the idea of risk communication, the perception gap, and audience engagement. And if you take risk communication as a process through which you're going to close that perception gap, as a process through which you're going to make sure that people accurately understand their risk for a given outbreak or public health crisis, then it becomes really important to start understanding how are audiences thinking, where are they getting their information from, and what does that tell us about what we need to be doing as communicators of information, right? So with that in mind, I started studying the place where audiences are going to get a lot of their news. Right now, increasing numbers of audiences in the United States are getting their news from social media. That can be any platform, but for the sake of my research, I chose to look primarily at Facebook and Instagram. And I came at this from a perspective that the way news is surfaced on social media platforms is very different now. If you think about scrolling through your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed, you're not being given things in a reverse chronological order anymore. You're being given things that are algorithmically oriented, and the algorithms that run Facebook's and Instagram's news feeds right now are tailored to this idea of engagement. Basically, they're tailored to the idea that if you're scrolling through, they want to show you the content that is going to be most engaging, and that's defined as content that's going to get you to click more, to like more, or to share more. And if it's content that's going to get you to do any of those three things, it's going to be content that tugs at your emotions in some shape, way, or form. When you're thinking about posting something on social media, as a news editor or someone running a public health Facebook page, you want people to engage with your content. And so oftentimes an emotional tone comes into play. In media studies, studying that emotional undertone of a piece of content is referred to using something called affect theory, which studies the emotional weight of things. So I started to think about what are the ways that people are searching for and thinking about diseases. And the first thing I did was examine how, during the Ebola outbreak in 2014, people in the United States were searching for information about Ebola as opposed to the flu, and I used Google Trends data for that. As you can see, many more people in the fall of 2014 were concerned about Ebola than they were about the flu, just based on Google searches alone. Then I started thinking about what happens if you do the same comparison with Zika. Again, you see that in the February-March period of 2016, many more people were searching for information about Zika than about flu. If you parse this data a different way, you see that most of the people searching for information about Zika were overwhelmingly from Florida, not from any of the other southern states that could have conceivably had a mosquito problem. So then I started thinking about what is it that's getting people to these places where they feel like, oh, there's a lot of weight to this. And so I looked at the Facebook posts put out by the Washington Post and the CDC, and I essentially did an affective analysis of the images. And for the sake of having a manageable research project, I only picked two organizations. This isn't to say that the Post and the CDC aren't great, but one thing you'll notice is that the CDC's images tend to be a bit more approachable. They show a human eye to the idea of protective equipment and personality. There are aid workers who are practicing with chocolate sauce on their hand. Dr. Wong has taped a picture of herself to her suit to come off as more approachable. Meanwhile, the Post's picture is very dark, it's very shrouded, the side of the wall says suspect, it looks very ominous, and if you're just scrolling, that tells you something on an emotional level about the content that you're looking at. Similarly, if you look at objects in space, one of the Post's pictures is showing a dead person as an object. There's something that's being buried to be kept distance from. Meanwhile, the CDC's pictures, again, convey a very light, approachable tone. You see this again when you think about the Zika outbreak. When the post was representing Zika, the picture that surfaced on Facebook, or a lot of them at least, was a pregnant woman shrouded in darkness, very little light, everything looks very ominous. Meanwhile, the CDC's picture was very targeted to pregnant women. There were actionable steps, and it was lighter. Yes, this is a disease and we need to be concerned, but there is a different emotional undercurrent to the pictures you're looking at. And of course, this analysis can go on for quite a bit. But when we think about the idea of affective news streams as a place where news is collaboratively constructed out of subjective experience, emotion, and opinion within an ambient news environment, we see that there are differences in what content is more sensationalist and what content is more personality-oriented. If we have to buy into a system where we have to communicate information on social media platforms, then what does that mean for us as communicators of accurate information? How do we buy into that system while also maintaining an amount of communicative distance, amount of emotional balance that doesn't necessarily weigh the conversation one way or another? Because as we just saw, there's already a lot of information out there, information disorder out there, which means that the information that we're communicating is more important than ever because it has to be right. It has to carry the correct emotional tone so that there's not necessarily too much weight on the issue. And essentially what I found was that there are large perception gaps, making risk communication and news coverage concern as well. The current landscape of social media-based news coverage is not necessarily addressing this issue, which means that audience engagement is also a public health concern. It's not just a concern for an editor in a newsroom or someone who's crunching the numbers from the business side in terms of how many click-throughs did we get or how much engagement did we get. And what are the next steps? They're really hard to define, but there does need to be more inclusion of audience concerns and engagement strategies, whether that is at a newsroom or whether that is at a public health organization. And there have to be steps ready to incorporate risk communication considerations into audience engagement plans. Maybe there's an exception for when there's a big outbreak. Maybe there's a different way of thinking about how you surface information during a disease outbreak. And more than that, we should make use of those social media targeting abilities that are available. If there is a demographic that is more at risk, use that targeting to reach out to them specifically and go where they're at, because this is where they're getting their information. Thank you.